If you have these children showing up at reception year and they're not able to put their coat on, or they're not able to go to the toilet alone, or they're not able to sit still for 15 minutes and listen to simple instructions, the amount and the quality of teaching that the teacher in that classroom can do, not just for that child, but actually for all of the other children sitting in that room as well, that's severely impacted. And so in some sense, it really matters that we're getting these earliest years right, because that's going to set the foundations for the school system to be able to be successful and do its main job, which is actually educating these children.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. One of the great joys of being at the IFS is that you get to be surrounded by data and facts. And if I think back to recent years, the statistics that keep coming back to me are really all about children and young people. And I'm going to give you some examples. Only half of children that are eligible for free school meals are achieving a good level of development by the age of 5. Another statistic, the number of children registered as needing the highest tier of support for special educational needs has risen 80% since 2018. 20%, that's 1 in 5, of 8 to 16-year-olds has a probable mental disorder. And a third, that's 1 in 3, children are referred to social care services at some point before they turn 18. And a quarter receive some sort of social care intervention. Now, I could keep going with a list of statistics that I find quite worrying. And it's worth saying I'm not the only one who's worried. One of the government's 5 missions is to break down barriers to opportunity. That's a pledge to break the link between a child's background and their future by tackling inequalities in early development, education and skills. So, over the next 4 weeks, while our nation's young people are hopefully off enjoying their summer holidays, we're going to bring you a special mini-series to get beyond those headline statistics and ask, are the kids okay? I'm going to be speaking to some of our country's leading experts to understand what the government is doing, what the evidence says about their approach, and whether the proposed reforms are ambitious enough to make real progress. To kick things off today, we're looking at the early years, where the government has a so-called best start in life strategy and wants to ensure that 75% of children reach a good level of development by the age of 5. To unpack all the issues in the early years, I'm joined by Christine Farquharson, who's an Associate Director at the IFS. She leads our work on early years and is going to be my podcast buddy throughout this mini-series. And our special guest today is Carey Oppenheim, who is Strategic Project Lead at the Nuffield Foundation, where she's led a major review on early childhood. She's also former Chief Executive of the Early Intervention Foundation and a former Special Advisor to Prime Minister Tony Blair on early years and poverty. So very huge welcome to both of you. So, Carey, I'm going to kick off with you on just why the early years matter so much. I mean, I think governments have long been interested in policies for kind of 5-year-olds and over, but I think it's fair to say that more recently, in sort of more recent times, they've been targeting policies at children before they even get to school. So, I mean, what's made people more interested in sort of these very young children?
Early childhood matters in itself because it's a period in a child's life when they're totally dependent on parent or carer. And also because we now have a really substantial body of evidence across different disciplines about the fact that this period is foundational and has long-lasting impacts in terms of people's future life chances, both through their childhood and into their adulthood. And so we also find out that inequalities between children begin very, very early. So if we're concerned about children's welfare and the wider society's welfare, then we should be concerned about what happens in the early years. I guess the other key reason that this area has had so much attention is because of the changes in women's working patterns, and they are going into the labour market. It's now most people are in, if they're into a 2-parent family, women are largely now in work, and therefore we've had to develop much better childcare provision. So I would say all of those reasons.
And I'm interested in the point you highlighted there, which I think is there's much more evidence on this now about the persistence of these inequalities. So when there is inequality in early years, you see it persisting throughout a child's life and into adulthood, and we're going to come back to that in the rest of the series. But do we know why that's happening? I mean, is it something about the child's environment is kind of the same across their childhood, or is something about, I don't know, their brain development or something happening to the child that kind of is fixed then in time?
It's difficult to say fixed, I'd say, but we do know from the brain science that it's a period of very, very rapid development. So in that sense, it is foundational. It starts to kind of provide kind of architecture for what happens later on. But similarly, also with the environment that the child is operating in, how they relate to their kind of main carer, their parent, grandparents, then provides a sort of framework for how they then develop relationships with other children and adults throughout their life, as well as all this incredibly rapid period of learning. Whether we're talking about physical development or we're talking about intellectual development or their kind of communication and language development, all of those things create a map and framework for their capabilities and then how those affect capabilities later on. So I think it's really important to say, you can't, this period is very important, but it's not that you can't change anything later on. So it's not deterministic, but highly influential.
And we were talking before this, Christine, about governments being interested now, not only in the sort of post-birth pre-5, but actually even in the kind of period after conception or even maybe before conception.
Yeah, so I think we've been on a journey in policy terms, and we've kind of started out with, children just spontaneously appear at age 5, and that's when the education department takes an interest. And then that became, maybe 3 and 4-year-olds, and now increasingly that's, we're quite interested in age 0 to age 2. Conception is a big part of that as well, and the pregnancy period is a big part of that as well. And now there's increasingly this sense of actually you need the mother to be healthy going into conception and going into pregnancy to be able to have the best outcomes there. So I think this is an area where you start with, we're really worried about labor market inequalities, or we're really worried about why people are not doing well in the labor market. And you start tracing that back through the education system. And almost every step backwards that you take in a child's life, you realize that there's something going on before that. And so you move your lens back even further.
And if we think about what the government's doing, part of what it's doing is about providing kind of a set of services to families that include mothers and, preconception, all that kind of stuff. But also part of what they're doing, I think picks up on what Carey was saying earlier, is about this kind of women parents, but particularly women in work. So maybe walk us through what's the government doing in this area broadly?
So the big picture point is the government's doing a lot more than they used to be doing. And I think Carey pointed that out. Where we've kind of gone with that, we've been on this journey between this question of what's best for children and what's best for children's development, what's best for parents and particularly mothers, and what's going to help them go out and take on paid work. And I'd say that there's also a third kind of shadow policy priority in the room, which is what's best for household budgets and what's best for the cost of living and how do we think the early years fits into the cost of living. And over different periods of time, different policy priorities have kind of been in the ascendancy. So if you go back to the late 1990s when we introduced the first free childcare, that was very much about early education and how are we going to support these kids. Over time, that became a little bit more of a sort of labor market focused policy. Then there was a switch back. We introduced some childcare for disadvantaged 2-year-olds. But now, very decisively in the last few years, there's been a shift towards saying we care a lot about the labor supply angle on this. That's the most sort of obvious reason for that, or the most obvious part of that, is that the government is in the middle of rolling out a really big expansion of funded childcare for children under the age of 3 who are in what's called working families, which means both the parents or the single parent are in paid work. And that's a kind of interesting decision because that's really tying this as childcare that is about helping those parents go out to the labor market and take on a paid job, rather than something that's saying which of the children in this cohort are the most disadvantaged, which of the children would benefit most from early education and childcare, and let's focus our resources there. You can't say one of those things is strictly better than the other, but there is a choice there and there is a trade-off.
I mean, Carey, I guess in some ways you've seen that transition happening. If we'd have rolled back to the kind of late 90s and we'd have asked you to predict what was going to happen, would you have predicted this trend? I mean, is it what you expected would happen?
That's difficult to say, but this sort of tension between how far is early years and childcare policy focused on mothers wanting to go into work and how far is it focused on children's outcome and particularly disadvantaged children has been there sort of throughout the development of that policy. I guess what is striking, and Christine, it's in your work, is also the change that's happened is the shift away. There's less spent now on the very young children, which again is now undergoing some change. But that is quite a big shift from where the Labour government got to, by the end of its kind of term of office in 2010. And also less focus on disadvantage, because I guess with that spending on people in work, you don't spend as much on there's less entitlement for the children who live in families where you're not in work. So there's a problem about fairness in the way the system is structured now.
I'll just on that particularly, just to kind of fact check on. So, what extent is it the case that actually everyone's getting more, but the additional funding's been focused more on childcare to let parents into work? Or is it actually we're actually giving less disadvantaged children now and more to another group?
Depends a little bit how you draw the lens of what counts as an early years policy. So if you look at the childcare system, it's not that we've been taking away or stopping entitlements for disadvantaged kids. What we have been doing is not increasing those. And so actually the number of 2-year-olds who are eligible for this disadvantage-based offer has fallen off a cliff. We sort of talk about it as the 40% most disadvantaged children. It's not. It's about 25%.
What is the offer here? What are families being offered?
So 2-year-olds who are in families with low income or have been in contact with the social care system, they get up to 15 hours a week of funded childcare. And that kicks in basically a year before the universal entitlement to 15 hours a week, which starts at age 3. So they're getting early entry into the system. But because the criteria for being eligible for that haven't changed since they were introduced in 2014, what we've seen is that it started out as 40% most disadvantaged kids, and now it's like the 25% most disadvantaged kids. It's really sharp. It's really stark.
So now I want to dig around in the kind of on the developmental side of this. So holding aside the kind of women's labour supply and going to work, just thinking about the children's outcomes. The government has the plan for change target, which is for 75% of 5-year-olds to reach a good level of development. I think I'm right in saying that currently only about 68% of children are reaching that. That means that almost about a third of children are not reaching a good level of development by 5. So, I mean, Carey, that sounds to me both like that's not a good outcome, but also 75% doesn't sound very ambitious. So maybe first, what are we actually measuring? What does it mean to have a good level of development at 5?
So the good level of development is assessed at the end of reception year, and it covers, there are 12 kind of measures, but it covers broadly 5 areas. So that's personal, social and emotional development, communication and language. It's about physical development, literacy and mathematics. It's a rounded measure. In that sense, it's a holistic measure, and that's a good thing because actually these things remain really important throughout your life, but they're really interconnected. So you're getting children to a level that they can do all of those things if you're achieving the good level of development. So that might mean, just very kind of concretely, it might mean children being able to listen and to take turns. It'll be children also being able to put their coats on. There's a lot of kind of self-regulation that we need when children start school. So it's a good and recognised measure. How ambitious is it? Well, I think there are 3 ways in which it's ambitious, even though it doesn't sound that ambitious. So firstly, I think the level of need that is present today is really high. So, we know child poverty levels are record high. And actually for children living in a family with a child under 5, it's 36% of those children are living in poverty. So that's really high. We know that the disadvantage gap between those children who are in receipt of free school meals and those and the rest is rising, and actually particularly for children with special educational needs. That just recently came out from the Education Policy Institute. So level of need is very high. We also see, this kind of surveys of what teachers say when they see children coming through the door. And again, a useful survey, which Kindred Squared, strong organisation working on the early years, has done, is to look at both what teachers are finding at that point in which schools are starting school, and what parents are finding. And they find really still major issues in relation to children, not being ready to learn, not being potty trained, not having the sharing and listening skills that they need to kind of benefit from school education. So,
and can I just ask on that? So, actually, one of my best friends is a teacher, and I've been chatting to her in swatting up for this whole series, and it really struck me that she described that over her sort of 16 years teaching, it seems like year on year to her, it's just getting worse, and that children are arriving at school less able to speak in simple sentences, write simple sentences, actually do some stuff that we used to think was really basic. So, I mean, is what you're saying that actually the kind of broader evidence is bearing out that actually over time children are less ready for school? Is that true?
We know that there was a kind of pause in the kind of increase in terms of reaching a good level of development. This survey is not, it's 1,000 parents, but those surveys that they've now done for a few years does show that teachers are finding it more difficult. They feel they're dealing with more basic problems. And I think this must be an overhang and consequence of COVID and the way in which that's both affected young children, but also parents' space, capacity to be able to kind of deal with some of the issues about, how you bring a child up, particularly if you're facing kind of other sorts of pressures.
And I think just to kind of draw that back to the question you asked earlier, Helen, you asked whether the early years is there something special about the early years? And if we improved conditions in the early years, does that actually make things easier later on? This is a really concrete example of why the answer can be yes. Because if you have these children showing up at reception year and they're not able to put their coat on, or they're not able to go to the toilet alone, or they're not able to sit still for 15 minutes and listen to simple instructions, the amount and the quality of teaching that the teacher in that classroom can do, not just for that child, but actually for all of the other children sitting in that room as well, that's severely impacted. And so in some sense, it really matters that we're getting these earliest years right, because that's going to set the foundations for the school system to be able to be successful and do its main job, which is actually educating these children.
So I'm still really struck that about a third of children aren't meeting this good level of development. I'm also, it's a good level rather than an excellent level. It's just like, it sounds like a minimum in some sense. I mean, what do we know about those children? I mean, is it something more like, actually a lot of them are quite close and they're going to get there, and some of them will only have just turned 5, and 5's a difficult, you're quite young, it's hard to measure some of these things. Or actually, to what extent is it more like, actually there are some children who are a long way away from that good level, and that, they're nowhere close to it, and they have actually sort of some more severe needs in order to get them up? I mean, Carey, how much do we know about that?
It's a mixture of those things. So we know, for instance, in relation to children who have a special educational need or disability, they are a long way away from their peers. So they're really important issues there about how do we start to address those in a more effective way than currently. For others, we know also that actually maths, for instance, there's quite a shortfall in terms, you may know the exact figures, Christine, but in terms of children reaching a good level of development. So that's something that we could target, although you don't only target it through maths, but also through language, which is also the root to everything. So there will be some people who could get that it's easier to get them over the line, and some children who will be really quite far away.
I think that's right. And I think that's always the challenge when you have, this target and say we're going to have 75% meet this target, is how do you intervene in a way that's going to make progress and get kids there without just focusing on the group of children who are the closest to making it, particularly, as Carey says, when a lot of those children who are sort of just missing out on that good level of development, it is around these more concrete skills, the math, the writing, the early sort of literacy, early numeracy. For me, if I looked at the early years a bit more holistically, and if I looked at it's called the foundation stage profile, the set of assessments a bit more holistically, I put a lot of weight on some of those more social and emotional development measures, because the evidence that we have shows that if you're looking to get benefits, not just sort of 1-2 years down the line, but really benefits that last over the life cycle, those social and emotional soft skills are much better predictors of an intervention that has staying power than just sort of putting a kid through a crash course on their numbers and just about getting them to be able to count to 10 6 months earlier than they otherwise would have.
Like I say, you're nodding along there, Carey. I mean, so I guess one is, do you agree with that? And if you're the government, how do you do that? How do you target those socio-emotional skills and get these children kind of up to speed?
I think that's exactly right, Christine. So how do you do it? So I think it's really important to remember, not just think about the 2, 3 and 4-year-olds, or indeed reception age, that are in provision already, but we think about the mother, father, and the interaction with babies and infants. And of course the target, because this target is for 2028, is going to focus more on the slightly older part of this cohort. And actually, if we're kind of really going to kind of tackle this, we're going to have to focus really from pregnancy. I mean, obviously, we've talked about the pre-pregnancy, but from pregnancy onwards in an intense way. And there's quite a lot of evidence about what you can do better. And the government has indeed, through its expansion of family hubs, the Best Start in Life Family Hub service is going to be really important in that regard, but forms a smaller proportion of the activity and the spending in relation to early years. And that is obviously because of what happened with the Sure Start provision. So I think there's something, it's going to be very important to work with the parent and the child and the level of interaction, support the other kinds of pressures that families experience, especially, when a child comes into the world. It's like huge excitement, joy, intense experience, but it's also a time of a lot of pressure and stress. And we really need to think about what's going on in the family as a whole.
And I think that's absolutely crucial. So, Helen, when you say, what does government do? How does government fix this? In a lot of policy areas, we're used to thinking about government pulls a little lever that sits somewhere in Downing Street or in Whitehall, and it's something to do with what the government does, and government trains people, and the government employs people, and the government goes out and does things. In the early years, that model of thinking about the world really doesn't work. Maybe it doesn't work anywhere, but it really doesn't work in the early years, because the only way that you are going to make a significant difference in the life of a child under the age of about 2 is by working with parents and getting families on side and helping and supporting parents and families to do what they want to do, which is give their child this best start in life. But it's not enough to have a home visitor come 1 hour a week and play with the kid, and that's going to magically reshape the kid's future. It has to come through the mechanism of changing what's happening in that household, in that family.
Yeah, so Carey mentioned that there was the Sure Start programme kind of under New Labour, where these sort of centres where people could go and get a holistic set of services that kind of got, not scrapped, but that was gone. And now there are family hubs. Maybe, Christine, tell us a bit about what is a family hub doing and who's really using that family hub? Because I guess there's an issue here about a parent might self-select into using some of these services, but maybe some of the people who are, and Carey's obviously absolutely right, it's a joyful but extremely intense period in your life. You have to sort of like know where to go and get help or service or how to use. So tell us about family hubs and what they're trying to do.
What family hubs are trying to do is, in some sense, they're trying to bring back some elements of what the Sure Start model had. In particular, they're trying to draw together lots of different services. So childcare services, early health services, support for speech and language needs, support for special educational needs, all kinds of stuff, employment help for parents as well. They're trying to put all of that together, and they're hoping that by doing that, they become this kind of one-stop shop that recognizes that actually all of these services matter and interact with one another in a child's life. That's the sort of aim. They're not, I wouldn't say that it is sort of Sure Start reborn, partly because family hubs are looking to serve a much wider age group of kids. But the big difference is that the level of funding is just nowhere near the level of funding that we would have had for Sure Start. And avid podcast listeners can go back a couple of weeks and listen to the episode we did on Sure Start at that point. In terms of how this works, and you had a kind of question about who's actually going to take up these services and use them. What we know from when we looked at Sure Start, actually those services did seem to be used by lots of different types of families. So different families use services in different ways. But we did see that the poorest families were going in and taking advantage of parenting support, or were going in and taking advantage of support with claiming benefits or support with getting a job. Slightly more affluent families were more likely to do the lighter touch, like stay and play services or baby massage. But there was a sense in which this was a place that lots of different kinds of families wanted to use, and lots of different kinds of families could find something that they valued.
I mean, Carey, how optimistic are you feeling about, obviously Sure Start is kind of gone, but there are these family hubs. I mean, is that the right direction of travel? Does it need to be bigger? Are they offering the right kind of services? I mean, what's your view on the whole thing?
I feel positive about them. The work that IFS have done in terms of understanding what the impact of Sure Start has been was, I think, highly influential in sort of reigniting this being a key part of the early years landscape. Because actually, when the government was in the kind of run-up to the election, was pretty much exclusively focused on childcare. So I do think that has, it is a really important anchor. I think, as has been said, there's much less money being kind of spent on it. I think that's the right kind of mix of services that we're talking about. And they are being located. I mean, and the wording is quite careful in the strategy document. They are being located in all local authorities, but in deprived areas within those local authorities, or where the need is greatest. And so that's a positive thing, because we want to make, if we're wanting to kind of reduce inequalities, it's obviously good to have them there. I think there are quite big questions about, there's a digital service that's going to be part of that. We still don't know that much about how effective digital interaction is. There's some growing evidence about that in relation to parenting interventions. And therefore, we need to be realistic about what it will be able to deliver in terms of the number that there are and the kind of depth of the service offer. Again, within the strategy, there's a kind of hint that the predominant focus will be on the early years, even though, strictly speaking, go up to 19, I think 18 or 19. That will be important, that we need that limited resource to kind of cluster on the early years. So I think it's a really important step in the right direction. All the issues about what kinds of interventions it will deliver and how we do that in a systematic way will be really important.
Actually, I was going to ask about that. Because on that, I mean, you could imagine these things offering kind of very transactional services, like you go and you get your baby weighed, or you go and you get help filling in a form, or you do something very transactional. But I guess if what we think needs to happen is the kind of shaping of the home environment and what parents do with their children when they're back at home, and the kind of the tips and tricks and techniques and all that kind of stuff. I mean, are there interventions that could really try and shape that home environment as opposed to do transactional?
Yeah, there absolutely are. So there's quite a wide set of evidence. And in Carey's previous life as chief exec of the Early Intervention Foundation, she will have sponsored a lot of the work that has been done. So we know there's a set of parenting programs that are sort of pretty robust and proven to work. There are home visiting programs that are robust and proven to work. Family nurse partnership would be one of those. There are lighter touch interventions that we have a pretty good sense that they work. So I would say that we're in a world where we have lots of individual tools, and we're pretty confident in many of those individual tools. Where we have much less evidence, and where there's just a much bigger element of figuring it out as we go along, is what's the best combination of those tools to bring together, and how do we get the families that we want to engage with the tools that we think are going to be most beneficial for them, or that they would find most beneficial for themselves. And that kind of leads you to this question of, well, how much actually is that national government or central government's role, versus how much should that be the local authorities who know their populations, versus how much should that actually be devolved down even further to the level of some of these centres who are working with these parents day in, day out. And you have there the trade-off between how do you make sure that the needs of the local population are being reflected and met, versus also not just always saying we're going to only give people what they say they want, because there is a sense where, some of these programs have really high quality evidence behind them, and we probably do in some cases want to be promoting and pushing that.
This is a new parent, you don't necessarily know what you need either, right?
Absolutely.
This little person arrives and you haven't got the manual, and you don't necessarily, I Carey, you say about digital offerings, but it's having a little person is a very physical thing, right? They are there, and actually the kind of more community based set of things you described, Christine, I can imagine being a better approach.
Yes. I think it's a really difficult kind of territory to navigate. And it's right, we've got really good evidence about, particularly around behavioural and social and emotional development for young children. Less good, interestingly, in relation to like cognitive skills, evidence-based, that's not so great in that territory. And I think there's a problem about implementation, and as you say, at which level do you want it? So I think people probably are searching for greater guidance about what are the evidence-based programs that are effective. But in practice, there are a lot of programs which are being commissioned at local level, which, have either very weak evidence or no evidence. So we should probably stop doing some things. And also, I think, get the sort of infrastructure right so that we can really understand and test and learn as, given the fact that the program in terms of family hubs is still, it's not huge scale. So that is an opportunity. We could test a combination of interventions and see how that works and adapt and change.
Yeah, we should get some data, Christine, and do some more testing. I mean, can I just move on to the childcare system? So if you think about where the government's kind of put its money, the money is really going to childcare. Basically, there's now a new leg of the welfare state, which is the provision of childcare to young children. We talked a little bit earlier about part of that being about helping parents back into work. But parking that, just thinking about children's development, you mentioned the cognitive skills. I mean, Christine, how much do we know about what early childcare does for the development of children?
In my view, less than we would like to know. So I think what we do know is that early childhood education or childcare, people use different terms, it can be really, really positive for children's development. Where you get into kind of the more difficult picture is that's not always the case. That's not universally the experience. There are some examples where actually it doesn't seem to have done much, if anything, for children, or has possibly even slightly held some children back. Held them back. So, for example, in Quebec, in Canada, there was a big sort of program of childcare subsidies there. It was brilliant for helping mothers to work. It was really, really successful at that. But on social and emotional development, the children who were started using these centres seem to have performed a little bit worse. And actually that seems to have been a kind of persistent impact on them as well. So I say that not to say, we should be, this is definitely what's happening, but to say that there is a kind of range of outcomes here. And that means we have to understand questions like, who should be getting this childcare? We have pretty good evidence there that for children, it's more beneficial for the most disadvantaged. But then you start asking questions like, when should it kick in? There we have much less good evidence. We have a lot of studies about 3 to 5-year-olds. We know a lot less about 0 to 2s. You start asking questions like, how much childcare should we be offering? Is 15 hours a week the right amount? Is 30 hours the right amount? Should it be 50 hours? Should it be unlimited? And there we have very little really to guide us. You start getting questions like, what kind of setting or how does what is the system actually? What does it look like? What do children actually experience when we get there? It's clear that higher quality care is better, but actually the best measures we have for what high quality care looks like come from going into the setting, sitting there for many hours or days and just observing the day-to-day pattern of life, how kids and providers are interacting. That's not really going to be feasible on a sort of regulatory wide scale beyond maybe every few years getting your Ofsted inspection done. So these questions of what do you actually as a regulator do to try and set up a system that's going to have the best chance of being a positive, supportive, beneficial experience for these children. There's still, I think, in my view, a lot that we don't know that we would like to.
And on this quality question, Carey, I mean, when I was looking around for childcare, for my 2 small people, it really struck me that there's quite a lot of differences in just what they were offering in some sense. They were just different offers to parents. Both in terms of the number of hours in the day, but also the kind of setting that was available. So there's sometimes quite a lot of choice out there. If you're just thinking about the development of children, I mean, what should parents and governments be looking? What makes a setting really good for a child's development?
So there are kind of 2 broad ways of thinking about it, both the sort of the structural kind of underpinning for that setting. So those are things like the qualifications of the staff-child ratio, the size of the group. And then there are these things, they call it process quality, measures of quality, which is really about the child's experience and the interaction between the people working in that setting, or it could be a childminder, and the child. And those are, wrapped up with the curriculum and what good practice is. So, just as important as those other structural things. So, as a parent going to have a look at, going into a nursery or visiting a childminder, you want to be kind of watching and looking for the kind of interaction that's going on does it feel like a stimulating, safe, caring environment? What's the interaction between the staff and the children? as well as those structural things. And I think the interesting gap that there is in terms of what supports good child development is particularly on the kind of baby and infant side, the sort of 0 to 2, where we have had more limited provision, and it's largely provided by the private, voluntary, and independent sector, where actually we don't have as much data about what constitutes quality in that area. But we do know things like that it needs some special training when you're working with babies and very small children. We know that the ratio is really important. You don't want to be working with 6 babies or whatever. And similarly, the size, the group size. So it's interesting. Nuffield Foundation is supporting somebody called Dr. Mona Sark, who's from Middlesex University, and she's working with others in this area. And they just did a survey of the size of baby rooms, how many people are within inside a baby room, and they found that it can range from 12 or lower babies, in a group, to up to 30. And then if you then have 10 adults, say, serving those 30 children, that is a very big group. And the evidence this is kind of global evidence, does suggest that isn't great for babies. Surprise, surprise, really. So I think, actually, and we talked earlier that we need to get this right from the beginning. So we've seen a big expansion that's going on in relation to that very early stage. And we really need to think hard about the quality of that provision. And often it's the lowest qualified early years part of the workforce that's working in the baby room. So how do we support them, their training, and how do we think about, what kind of... And you're also not just supporting the child, you're supporting the parent.
I mean, the government is putting a lot more money into this than it was even a few years ago. As Carey said, if you think about provision for very small babies and very small children, it's very person intense. It's kind of expensive to provide this care. So even though there's many billions going into the system, is there realistically enough going into the system that providers can really provide the kind of quality of care you might need for 2-year-olds, say?
I have over many years been asked, what should the price be? What would be enough? And I've always resisted answering that question because it's a super hard question. And it comes down to, what level of quality are you actually trying to get here? More money is always going to buy you more opportunity to provide better quality care, that's for sure. What we've seen with the expansion of the new entitlements is that the government is trying to pivot the funding system to better reflect the fact that these very youngest children are much more expensive to provide care for. And so before these entitlements were rolled out, childcare providers tended to charge about £6 an hour, a little bit more than that, on average, per hour of childcare, whatever the age of the child, all the way from sort of age 1 to age 4. That's wildly unrepresentative of the underlying costs of these kids, because you can have, maybe 3 kids per adult in the baby room. You can have up to 13 3- and 4-year-olds per adult. The government's going to try and tilt that. And so there is going to be, if you're providing care for 1-year-olds and you were getting £6 and a bit, and you're now getting £11.22 an hour, you're looking at that and saying, actually, that is a chunky increase in my resources, and potentially I can do a lot more than I used to be able to. But I think there are then questions of how that money gets used. And what we've seen from some survey evidence is providers seem to be a little bit slow to pass some of that on in terms of higher wages for their staff. Those staff, unsurprisingly, are not that well paid. They don't have that much job satisfaction. They're quite likely to leave pretty quickly. And that turnover and churn of staff can be a real problem, both for settings trying to manage these places, but also for that child who probably wants to develop a bit more of a stronger attachment to their one worker. And so I think there are questions of the English government's approach. England's approach has very much been, we're going to fund it, we're going to set some minimum standards on regulation, and then it's a market, and we're going to let things work themselves out, and we're going to assume that parents are seeing the quality of these settings and picking the setting that delivers the best quality that meets the needs of their child. I think that gets a lot more difficult to do if you're in a world where parents are facing very long waiting lists, where parents are really worried about moving their child from one setting to the next. They're really worried about advocating for themselves because they feel a loss of control. And so it's just hard to show up at the door of the setting and judge, is this really a high quality place? And
it's also hard because you haven't got experience of doing it before, or you're doing it for the first time, and you're also trying to weigh up things like, is it on the way to work? Can I reasonably commute to that place? Is it open for long enough hours? Or it's It's a tough decision.
It's really tough. And what that toughness means is that this logic of it's a market, it's going to sort itself out, that really starts to get chipped away at. And so you end up with parents maybe paying more than they otherwise would, or maybe accepting lower quality than they otherwise would, because the sense of competitive pressure which is going to raise the standards, I think that's not really working the way that the government sometimes thinks or maybe hopes that it does.
We should wrap up soon. I'm going to ask you both the same question in some sense, and I'll start with you, Christine. I mean, how overall, looking at the whole early years system, I mean, how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the state of that system? And, if you were sitting in the Department of Education, or if you're advising the Department of Education, what would be your biggest priority for saying we have to do something about this?
So I think one thing that's made me feel much more optimistic is there is a growing sense. The policymakers who I talk to are increasingly aware of and thinking about these challenges and trade-offs between what's labor supply, what's child development, what's about affordability. And there's a growing recognition that there probably isn't just one lever called early years that you pull and magical things automatically spill out the other end. I think we did see that in this most recent strategy, where there's a sense of, yes, the childcare is an important part of that, but also that family hubs and this wider service provision are important. And actually, we might need different policies to achieve different aims. So I think that's really good. There is a lot of money going into the system. And if I were sitting in DFE, I'd be taking a really hard look at whether I'm getting the outcomes that I want for the money that's going in. Part of that is going to be a question of how much funding should different types of programs attract. Part of that's going to be around targeting. And I think a big part of that is going to be around market design and regulation as well. And these kind of questions of how do you actually ensure that the provision is good and being delivered efficiently?
What about you, Carey? You've been advising governments for a long time in some sense. You've seen all the evidence that we've got, and it's not perfect, but you've seen a lot of this. I mean, how are you more or less optimistic than you were, say, 10, 15 years ago? And what was the big thing that you wish the government would do or change?
So, yes, I do feel optimistic. I think because we've learned a lot since we tried this, 20 years ago. And there is also that it's the knowledge and understanding is not only held inside central government and local government, but also in the sort of wider society. So things like, the Royal Foundation has this kind of Centre for Early Childhood, doing a lot of work to how to kind of raise knowledge and understanding among kind of parents as a whole. There are lots of other sort of actors in the system that also understand that. So I think it feels like it's a good moment to prioritize early years in the sense that you're kind of pulling on a wide pool of knowledge and sort of and motivation and understanding. I think, it's obviously very different from when I was in government, when there was, it's a much, much easier kind of fiscal situation. And we were kind of at the outset of trying these things. If I was sitting inside DFE, I would particularly prioritize the workforce, because that is going to be really kind of core for the long term in terms of how we build on their strengths, really provide important routes for progression, look at their pay and conditions, because that is the kind of core of what a good service looks like. I agree with you, Christine. I think we need to, in terms of value for money and the regulation, I mean, if government is funding around 80% of childcare, what sort of conditionality or partnership way of working with providers should we be thinking about so that we get value for money, that we ensure that children with special educational needs are given the attention that they need. And then just one other thing, which I think is not really about the Department for Education, but how it links with the Department of Work and Pensions and the other departments, Department for Health, is unless we really get to grips also with the challenges in terms of poverty and cost of living and all of the stresses that brings, that needs to be part of a strategy to raise children's capabilities and skills. And so it needs to be part of the picture. So we tend to talk about Department for Education, Department for Health. We talk less, unless we're talking about parents going into work, about the impact of poverty on children's developmental outcomes. And that is also really critical.
I think it's a great place to kind of draw to an end the point that there's, as you were saying earlier, Christine, there is no one lever here. There's lots of things you're thinking together. I've loved this discussion, and not just because I've got two little people and I have to think, I think a lot of time about how to support them, but I'm really struck that there is a lot of evidence out there about how important the early years are for children. Therefore, we should all care about that in society because it matters. Governments are clearly doing a lot more to target policies at children from the start of life, and we have some evidence there. I think there are three things I take away from this discussion. One is that I'm still left with a sense that too many of our children are getting to 5 without the skills that they need, and that we should all worry about that because, as you've both really well set out, those gaps in development are just really persistent across childhood and adulthood, and therefore we can't afford to ignore those gaps when they're arising. It really is the whole system that matters, and not just the whole education system or the whole childcare system, but broader policies that support families and that think about poverty. And you have to think really about all of these things. And a very IFS takeaway that there really are trade-offs here. The government has made a big move into childcare and a big focus on supporting the parents of young children into work. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not exactly the same thing as trying to target the developmental outcomes of children. Therefore, we have to have a really clear-headed discussion about what is the government trying to achieve and how do you change what you're doing depending on what you want. And given the government is now such a big part of the childcare market, they can't afford not to be thinking about the structure of the market and how you regulate it and what you do there. So still more to do. But on that, let me say a huge thank you to Christine. Thank you to our special guest, Carey. And thanks to all of you for listening to the IFS Zooms In. Please do join us for part 2 of our mini-series, where we'll explore the issues facing school-age children and what the government can do in that area. And if, after listening to this, you have questions, please do jot them down, because at the end of this series, we're going to run a special Q&A episode to bring the voices of parents, teachers and young people into the debate. If you enjoyed this episode, do subscribe in your podcast app and share it with anyone you think might be interested. Perhaps you can pop it onto your parents' WhatsApp group, which I've recently discovered, if you're part of one. And if you'd like to support our work, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. You can check the link in the episode description. But for now, thank you again for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next time.